It was a tragedy. It was one of the worst things that ever happened in human civilization.
Any war is terrible. Any war is terrible.
They didn't half the time know what was going on. It was just awful.
And I never really thought about it, but it sort of hit me that, like, wow, it's sort of like the names that I know, and I'm like, it is where I live now. It really was here, and it's so real.
I've worked in this community for about 15 years, so I know a lot of the people really quite well. So it's kind of making me emotional now to hear and relive some of the stories that they were sharing.
I'm always fascinated by the thought of what my maternal grandfather and paternal grandmother would have been going through. They were both teenagers.
And I'm 18 and I like to think I have a promising future. I want to do stuff with my life. And to be plagued by war, it's just a scary thought if that was to happen today. Like.
I was born in Guildford. I've always lived in Guildford. And my mum and dad were born in Guildford.
Rain pouring heavy, jacketed soldier awaits, battle on its way.
People sometimes have this image in their mind of a kind of golden Edwardian age of peace and sunshine, and suddenly the war broke out like a thunderstorm in a summer sky. It wasn't at all like that. The build-up towards the war had begun in the early years of the century.
Holy Trinity is the civic church, so it had quite an important role during the war. For example, when war was declared, there was almost immediately a service was held of intercession.
Thousands flocked to sign up to become soldiers.
Everyone volunteered, whole villages, to go to war.
I go in an instant, but I would go as a regular member.
I would go, but knowing what I know now, the soldiers, they didn't know what was going to happen.
Everyone thought it would be over very soon, and they were very keen to join up. So Guildford apparently was, thronged with young men.
If you have a family, I would think that I would personally choose to stay at Higham because I have someone to keep.
There was a story being told around the teenagers that were encouraged to sign up because it was glorified, but actually they had no idea really what they were signing up to. Something very different to home.
It's heavy.
You think of the men in trenches there, never really clean, never really dry. Having come from England's farmland and what have you, when, the beauty of this sort of thing into the horror.
Then there were others who joined because they felt they must. This chap, Ivan Bennett, he joined up because he felt he should. But it's clear from the letters that he wasn't a soldiering type. And sadly, he was killed.
This was the first time that the British had put their citizen army into the field. The notion of the British sending its sons abroad was very new.
If I was a wife in that time, my husband had to go off and leave me with a couple of children, I would have been heartbroken.
A lot of them in the First World War disguised their ages and they signed up in between 16 and 19.
I've got grandchildren of that age and I just think it's dreadful, absolutely dreadful.
To sort of be more mature than they were, like they were acting more mature than their age, just so they could help out with the war and stuff.
I wonder how long this bloody war will go on, she thought as she rode. Her mum had not heard from her father who had gone over 6 months ago. Daisy's heart was sad. The world felt such a cruel place. When would it all end?
Girls and women knitted scarves and mittens and so on for soldiers, things we'd now expect the army to provide, but then there was scope for a lot more voluntary help. There was one heroic lady called Mrs. Jelly who made 2,500 sandbags.
Princess Mary, the King's daughter, set the standard when on the first Christmas she sent out boxes with tobacco and this is the sort of thing the soldiers thought was great. Here in Guildford for the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment, the commanding officer's wife from the depot here in Guildford parcelling up the goodies that are handed into them. And this was actually a rather important way of keeping morale going.
There were some military hospitals in Guildford. There was something called the War Hospital Supply Depot, which was set up in a lot of places, and volunteers were asked to come along and to roll bandages.
I just remember a great aunt of mine, my dad's aunt. She was a nursing sister during the First World War, and I did have pictures of her nursing up at Surrey County Hospital with the troops that were brought home.
My other nan, she is, you can see there's a cross at the top there. Somebody says that looks like me, but I don't know.
They made one of the schools around here into a church, into a hospital as well before it opened.
The school medical officers had big roles because there were diseases going around schools, and it was they had to decide whether to keep them open or not. I think I'd rather be with my family because being in the school wouldn't be as safe.
Some things were restricted because of wartime. There was no street lighting, so that put people off going out to meetings at night. Some were rescheduled so they would happen during the night of a full moon, so people could get out. And there was a feeling that people shouldn't be celebrating or holding sort of festivities during the war. They felt it'd be wrong.
And I've learned about how it affected schools and how a lot of male teachers were, they all enlisted in the war, which meant that female teachers needed to step up and there needed to be more of them teaching the young children.
Well, I'm all for strong women, and I think they did a marvellous job.
Women got the vote soon afterwards because of they had to bring the women into the factories.
Female and males should be treated the same as much as possible because they can do kind of the same or different jobs, but around about this time they weren't allowed to, and they were just treated as a wife, got to look after the kids, got to look after the home.
Being brought up in the village with them, they're doing as what we can call now a smallholding, everything to do with the fields and the animals and crafty works, making blankets, dealing with the wool, crochet, knitting, embroidering, really the domesticated stuff. Yes, I do remember them quite well, both my grandmothers.
Dad was in the war, but Mum wasn't. No. She should teach the sign language with your hands. She's a teacher, and she was manageress in a laundry.
Mum was one girl with 8 brothers, and my dad had only had one sister with lots of brothers. So when he had 3 girls, he was the envy of all the family. Yes.
They set up a creche for children, which sounds very modern for working mothers.
So the young children were being taught more about like cooking and stuff, about learning to be a soldier like the boy students.
The local draper's shop in the high street had a fire, and so there was a recreation of a Flanders trench scene to say, this is what the front looks like, please give generously.
Others were able to make a lot of money in specialist vehicles or aircraft manufacture or boilers or shells and stuff.
You had Dennis's producing lorries for the army and fire engines, etc. Drummonds were producing lathes for the ships and the mobile machine shops.
These biscuits were designed to have the maximum amount of nutrition and calories in them for their weight and their size. I imagine Huntley and Palmer's did really rather nicely during the war out of their production of biscuits.
And in fact, Guildford introduced rationing earlier than other towns in the country.
Bread was really very short indeed during the First World War. But because of the Atlantic blockade, bread was in short supply and had to be adulterated with various other things.
Potato. That's nice, yeah.
It hasn't got a lot of taste in it, has it? No.
I'll have a bit of strawberry jam on that.
One of the ways in which money was raised from the citizens of Britain was the war bond scheme. The government would put an advert in the local paper, it's your duty, please buy these war bonds to finance a tank with the name of Guildford, or finance an aeroplane, a Sopwith Camel, which would be associated with a particular town or county.
The playing field is broken and friends are upset by the sadness. The bombing is so unusual that we are perplexed by it. My father is at World War and we are all missing him, very much so.
In many ways, the most shocking event of the war in Guildford was in October 1915, when a Zeppelin dropped a dozen bombs on St Catherine's, little hamlet to the south of the town.
St Catherine's was bombed by a Zeppelin.
It was about the gunpowder place that they were trying to blow up, but they were completely and utterly lost.
My mother's strong memory was of the Zeppelin coming over Guildford, and her words were coming along Guildford Park Road, because that's where the family lived.
Now the war was coming to England, to the homes of ordinary people.
It didn't seem like there would be much danger at home, but there was like trenches and all sorts reinforcing here. So it must have caused a lot of panic.
They did actually have a plan that everybody in Guildford should pack a few light things and meet in Stoke Park, where guides would then lead them. One doesn't know quite where, presumably on foot along the London road.
I read about there's cinema and theatre and the gramophone become extraordinarily popular forms of entertainment. People would have wanted something to get lost in, to not have to think about all the negative things that were happening.
My toes are so sore. Who cares for king and country? I hate this stupid war. Join the army now. That's what the poster told me. I wish I had known.
So many volunteer for the forces, but of course so many of them were killed, that they needed to be replaced, and eventually it was decided that the only way was to force people to join, to conscript them. Guildford had what was called a tribunal that interviewed those who wished to avoid conscription.
Conscientious objectors. They always considered them as cowards.
And if they saw somebody who they thought ought to be in uniform in the street, they would hand them a white feather. Now that person could well be disabled, they could well be in a reserved occupation, and so it was rather indiscriminate, this business of handing out white feathers, I feel.
The gentleman in question, he objected on sort of Christian morals sort of ground, and he was sent to prison, and very sadly he went on to take his own life. His father made it known publicly that he didn't agree with his son's beliefs. I think he was trying to sort of absolve himself from any connection with his son, which again is very sad.
I remember my father talking about how that many soldiers deserted and ran away from and were called cowards and so on. And later they were hauled back by the military police and they were treated very, very badly.
But those were the guys that went out with the stretchers to pick up the people that had been shot during the actual fighting and then running back with them, the medics. A lot of them were conscientious objectors. And to me, that is not exactly being a coward.
Dear Sis, it is hell on earth here, but I'm doing my bit. Much love, bruv.
November the 11th was always something that, not that we celebrated it in our house, but my dad always used to sit and watch it, and I can remember sitting and watching it with him, and how emotional he used to get.
The reason that the 2-minute silence came into being was that people in the town where I was, in Surrey, wanted to be able to go about their daily business, but they realised they were also thinking, you know, the men mainly, people are not here, they're fighting. We've got to incorporate them, we've got to remember them, we've got to think of them.
The war memorial that was built in the castle grounds was the lasting memorial of the conflict. People went there very diligently on the 11th of November each year. It was became a significant event in the town's calendar, and to a large extent it still is today.
Holy Trinity has a very large war memorial to the Queen's Regiment, which was the local regiment stationed at Guildford.
Guildford's done a good job. The government-initiated VC stones, of course, is important, and ours are very public, being in Tunsgate rather than being on the individuals' houses.
Captain Grenfell was born in Clarendon, just the other side of Guildford, and he volunteered to go into the army. He was one of the first officers to receive the Victoria Cross. He went to France to fight, and he was wounded 3 times. He came home twice, and then he went back a 3rd time, and was unfortunately killed in 1914. The families were so proud when they came to see him displayed. And I am very, very proud to have been part of that, in a small way, to be part of the crowd that was stood there that day to honour those 2 very, very brave soldiers.
As you walk up the stairs in the cathedral to the West Gallery, you're walking up a war memorial, a memorial to 3 men of the same family who all lost their lives in the Royal Navy.
There's what's called a roll of glory in the church, which was a list of all the men who had been killed in the war, whose families wanted them remembered on that memorial.
The names run to 11,000, one of whom is my grandfather's brother, another is his cousin. There are so many families that have a connection with that roll of honour.
Although it might look just like a list of those who died, it was much more important to the people at the time to have somewhere where they could go and think about their son or their brother or their husband.
That cathedral represents the spirit of service and of sacrifice which characterised so much of the 20th century.
Ruby went to war, carrying her husband's coin, soldiers' teeth improved. Thoughts of Shamley Green often went through Ruby's mind, how she missed her home.
If you knew somebody who was at war fighting, then it must have been really hard to live your life and wonder, are they alive, and have to wait for news about them.
And you know, and when you lose 20 to 30,000 people in one day, it's unbelievable, you know.
Someone that got killed in the First World War, their family got sent a death penny. Now, that is a death penny.
I have to relate it to my age, so how I'd feel to it. I'm 18, so I'd be serving in the war, and to see myself in that kind of climate, guns firing, post-traumatic stress disorder afterwards, you know, people don't come back for that.
And by the end of the war, of the whole of the people that went to fight in 1914, the Queen's Regiment, only 17 survived. So that's pretty horrendous, isn't it?
I always remember a letter she wrote to my dad saying she'd be glad when this wicked war is over and get back to normal.
There were efforts in Guildford to accommodate the returning soldiers. Onslow Village was built for that, but that wasn't opened until the 1920s, so there would have been some years when things were very difficult.
A lot of people just didn't want to know, you know, after the war, as you can expect. You know, they came home heroes, expecting some benefits, and of course during the First World War they got very little. I know they did actually buy a tank which was parked at the bottom of the North Street for a time, where they collected money for it.
The last thing they wanted to see was a reminder of those terrible events that they'd been forced to experience.
Great-grandfather lived in the little bedroom all on his own because he was quite aged. He'd actually got war wounds. He had been shot a couple of times, and he used to sit there smoking a pipe and can remember the smell of the tobacco that he used to use.
One of my granddads was in the war, and I spent a lot of time with them. Real Londoners, real sort of cockneys, they call them. But they were nice nature.
Well, I think it took quite a while for my grandfather to, when he came back home, to get into a normal way of life.
I was born in 1932, 14 years after the war ended. And my mother and father, although they didn't speak an awful lot about it, it had affected them. My father had lost 2 older brothers within a week of each other, so that had affected the whole family quite badly.
When I left home, I come to live in Guildford, you see. Yeah, so we couldn't talk a lot about things then. Yeah, yes.
I think really they should have come and talked about it so that everyone could understand what actually happened out there.
They didn't really describe it exactly as it was, I don't think. It was just awful.
I was 2 years old, and I just remember sitting on her lap as, you know, and that's only pictures, seeing pictures of it. A grandfather I had later, but he never talked about the war at all. I don't know why, but he didn't.
Grandad, well, he was shell-shocked and he didn't speak. Even though the war was over, it took many years for them to sort of stop thinking, well, we need that for tomorrow, you know. That stuff was there, but I think that took a long time.
One of the government schemes was to set them up in small holdings where they'd grow fruit and vegetables. And they instituted a market in North Street every week for them to sell their produce and make a living that way. And in fact, that market is still going today.
It's been an absolute pleasure, but also a really emotional journey to have been part of this project. And I've, as a team member working for the Borough Council, it's been heartfelt, but also really emotional.
I've only really learnt like the outlines of World War I and not about like the stuff inside, like especially in Guildford, you just learn as a whole.
It was always said to us, you know, you must never forget what these people did for us.
I think that that's really important, that we value that people have shared such a raw and emotional story, and we celebrate and say thank you for that.
Why should the British government call me up and take me out to a battlefield to shoot a man I never knew, whose language I couldn't speak? All those lives lost for a war finished over a table. Now, what is the sense in that?
So does anyone know Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag?
Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. Yes, we do.
Just
fun. Smile, boys, that's the style. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. So pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile.
We do.
Never played a lot of times. You didn't have television, you only had radio.
That's true. Yes.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? Yeah.
Celebrate